Right now, tucked into millions of bags, pockets, and drawers around the world, there is a small booklet. It is rarely more than a few inches across. It has your photograph, your name, your date of birth, and the country that claims you as its own. It is called a passport. And if you have one, a good one, you might not think about it very much. You hand it over. A border agent flips through it. A stamp hits the page. And you walk through. But for hundreds of millions of people, that moment is anything but routine. The passport they carry determines not just where they can travel, but how they are perceived, how long they have to wait, and sometimes whether they are allowed through at all. Today, a single document, something you could lose at the bottom of your bag, quietly shapes the freedom of billions of people. But here is what most people never stop to ask. Where did the passport come from? Who decided that human beings needed permission to move across invisible lines drawn on a map? And why do some of those little booklets open doors, while others keep them firmly shut? This is not just a story about travel documents. This is a story about power, about how governments have always tried to control people, not just where they live, but where they can go. It is a story that stretches from ancient empires to post-9/11 security states, from wax seals to biometric microchips. The passport is not just a travel document. It is a political instrument. And to understand it, we have to go back, way back, before stamps, before photographs, before borders, as we know them, even existed. For most of human history, the idea that you needed government permission to travel would have been almost unthinkable. In the ancient world, movement was largely determined by two things: geography and loyalty. You stayed close to home because travel was dangerous, slow, and expensive. And if you traveled far, what mattered was not which country you were from, because countries, in the modern sense, did not exist, but rather who you served. Some of the earliest records of controlled movement come from ancient Mesopotamia, the region that is modern-day Iraq. Clay tablets from as far back as 2000 BCE record systems of authorization for travelers moving through imperial territories. These were not passports in any sense we would recognize today. But the impulse behind them, a central authority deciding who is allowed to move, is exactly the same impulse that drives every border checkpoint in the world right now. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's court maintained tight control over who entered and exited its territory. Letters of authorization, written on papyrus and bearing royal seals, were issued to travelers, merchants, and diplomats. Without such documents, crossing Egyptian territory could mean detention, or worse. The Persian Empire, one of the largest the ancient world had ever seen, operated one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems of its time. Persian kings issued travel authorizations to officials, dignitaries, and messengers moving across their vast territory. These documents specified who the traveler was, where they were going, and what resources they were entitled to along the way, including food and lodging at imperial storehouses. We know this not from speculation, but from actual records. Thousands of clay tablets discovered at Persepolis, the Persian imperial capital, document the movement of workers, officials, and envoys across the empire, complete with details of what they were authorized to receive and why. One of the oldest references to something resembling a travel document appears in the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah, written sometime around the 5th century BCE. Nehemiah, a Jewish official serving at the court of the Persian king Artaxerxes, asks permission to travel to Jerusalem to oversee the rebuilding of the city's walls. The king grants his request and, crucially, provides him with letters addressed to the governors of the territories he must pass through, guaranteeing him safe passage along the way. This is not just a religious story, it is a document of how the ancient world worked. Movement required authorization. Authorization came from power, and power expressed itself through writing. The Roman Empire took this concept even further. Rome's power rested on movement of armies, trade, and information, and the famous Roman road network, stretching tens of thousands of miles across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, was the empire's circulatory system. Roman officials traveling on imperial business carried a document called a diploma, essentially a certificate that entitled the bearer to use the imperial post system, known as the cursus publicus. This system allowed authorized travelers to change horses, receive accommodation, and move quickly across vast distances. But the diploma was not for everyone. Ordinary Romans and non-Romans had no such privileges, and for those on the margins of the empire, crossing certain territories without authorization was dangerous. The theme here is not identity, it is loyalty. These early travel documents were not primarily about proving who you were as an individual. They were about demonstrating who you served, which authority had sanctioned your movement and was prepared to vouch for you. Jump forward to medieval Europe, and the picture becomes even more layered. The feudal system carved the landscape into a patchwork of territories, each governed by lords, bishops, and kings whose authority overlapped in complicated and sometimes contradictory ways. Safe conduct letters became one of the primary ways that travelers, merchants, and diplomats moved through this fractured landscape, issued by a king, a bishop, or a powerful lord. These documents stated that the bearer was under the protection of the issuing authority, and should be allowed to pass without harm. Harming someone traveling under a safe conduct letter was considered a serious offense, a violation not just against the individual, but against the authority that had issued the letter. Pilgrims, among the most common long-distance travelers of the medieval world, also carried documents of authorization. Letters from the Church identified them as legitimate religious travelers and provided a degree of protection on roads that were otherwise extremely dangerous. What is striking about all of this is that movement, throughout the ancient and medieval world, was about authority and protection, not about the modern concept of national identity. You traveled under someone's protection. You were loyal to a lord, a king, or a church. Where you were born mattered far less than who you served. That would begin to change, slowly and then, suddenly. Something profound began to shift in Europe between roughly the 14th and 17th centuries. The old world of feudal loyalties, where one's identity was tied to who their lord was, began to give way to something new, the nation-state. This was not a sudden change. It was messy, violent, and drawn out over centuries of war, plague, and political upheaval. But the direction of travel was clear. Across Europe, centralized governments were consolidating power. Kings were asserting authority over nobles. Bureaucracies were expanding. And with that expansion came new questions that would reshape the relationship between individuals and governments forever. The questions were, who belongs here, and who doesn't? One of the earliest drivers of movement control was not war, it was disease. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. Entire cities were devastated, and as the plague spread, it became clear that it moved with people. Authorities began introducing what we might recognize today as quarantine measures. The word itself comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days. The period ships arriving at Venetian ports had to wait before passengers could disembark. Cities also began restricting the movement of people from infected areas. Documents were sometimes required to prove that a traveler was not from a plague-stricken region. This was a new use of movement control, not to protect the state's power, but to protect public health. The logic is familiar to anyone who lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. War was the other great driver, as religious conflicts tore Europe apart in the 16th and 17th centuries. The wars of religion in France, the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, the English Civil War. Governments became acutely anxious about the movement of people across their territories. Spies, refugees, mercenaries, foreign agents, all of them moved along the same roads as merchants, pilgrims, and ordinary travelers. It became difficult to tell them apart. How do you know who is a legitimate traveler and who is a threat? The answer, increasingly, was documentation. It is around this period that the English crown begins to appear prominently in the history of the passport, specifically in connection with King Henry V of England in the early 15th century. Henry V is often cited as one of the first European monarchs to formalize something resembling a modern travel document, using the authority of the Crown to issue letters of safe passage to travelers moving through English-controlled territories. The word passport itself is believed to derive from the French passer, meaning to pass, and port, meaning gate or port of entry, a document that allowed you to pass through the port. What is more important than the etymology is the shift in purpose. By the Tudor era in England in the 16th century, travel documents were increasingly being issued not just to protect the traveler, but to serve the state. They identified the traveler, stated their purpose, and authorized them to request assistance from local authorities. This was control moving in a new direction. States were not just deciding who could come in, they were beginning to track who was going out, and why. And the machinery to support this was expanding rapidly. The rise of centralized bureaucracies, with their registries, their clerks, their seals, and their archives, made it possible, for the first time, to systematically issue and track documents across large territories. The modern state was learning how to see its own population. The French Revolution provides perhaps the most dramatic example of how state control over movement can intensify almost overnight. In revolutionary France, the laissez-passer, a type of internal travel permit, became not just a bureaucratic formality but a document of survival. During the Terror, failure to produce the correct papers at a checkpoint could mean arrest, imprisonment, or the guillotine. The revolution had abolished the old feudal order, but in its place came a new and in some ways more intrusive system of state surveillance. The revolutionary government needed to know where people were, where they were going, and whether they were loyal to the Republic. Napoleon took this even further. As his armies swept across Europe, the French imperial administration imposed passport systems in the territories it controlled. These systems varied in their strictness, but the principle was consistent. Movement required authorization, and authorization came from the state. The Napoleonic Wars also did something else. They dramatically accelerated the drawing of modern European borders. turning what had been fuzzy, overlapping zones of authority into hard, militarized lines. And wherever you draw a hard border, you immediately need a system for deciding who can cross it. The stage was being set for the modern passport. But the trigger, the event that would finally force passport standardization onto the international agenda, was still a century away. August 1914, the world went to war. What followed was 4 years of industrialized slaughter on a scale humanity had never witnessed. By the time it was over, the map of Europe had been torn apart and redrawn. Empires that had stood for centuries, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman, the Russian and the German Empire, had collapsed. In their place rose new nations, new borders, and millions of people who suddenly did not know which country they belonged to. Millions of people were displaced. Former subjects of collapsed empires found themselves stateless, existing in a political no man's land, belonging to no country, recognized by no government. Refugees flooded across new borders that had not existed a decade earlier, and the world had no coordinated system for managing any of it. At the same time, the war had transformed how governments viewed movement. For 4 years, every major European power had imposed strict passport and visa requirements. Movement across borders had been tightly controlled, monitored, and in many cases prohibited entirely. Governments had discovered just how powerful movement control could be as a tool of national security, and they were not eager to give it up. Into this chaos stepped the newly formed League of Nations, the world's first major international organization, born out of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The League had ambitious goals. It wanted to prevent another world war and to promote international cooperation. And one of the immediate practical problems it needed to solve was the chaos of inconsistent and often mutually unrecognized travel documents. In October 1920, the League of Nations convened the Paris Conference on passports, customs formalities, and through tickets. It sounds dry, but what came out of it would reshape how every human being on Earth was identified for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The conference brought together representatives from dozens of countries to tackle a basic but profoundly important question: what should a passport look like? Before this conference, passports varied enormously from country to country. Some were single sheets of paper. Others were elaborate multi-page booklets. Some had photographs and others did not. Some listed the traveler's physical description: height, eye color, hair color, distinguishing marks. Others simply bore a name and a seal. Border agents around the world frequently encountered documents they had never seen before and had no way of verifying. The 1920 Paris Conference established the first international standards for passports. The recommended format was a booklet, approximately 15.5 by 10.5 centimeters, close to the modern passport size. It should contain a photograph of the holder, it should include a physical description, and it should be issued by a nationally recognized government and accepted by other signatory states. This was, in retrospect, a remarkable moment. For the first time, the international community was agreeing on what a human being's identity document should look like. They were deciding, collectively, how the world would verify that you are who you say you are. The inclusion of photographs deserves special attention. Before the First World War, most passports did not include photographs. Identity was established through physical description: height, eye color, perhaps a scar. But physical descriptions are easy to forge, easy to misread, and entirely dependent on the judgment of the border agent standing in front of you. The photograph changed everything. Suddenly, a document could be tied to a face, and a face, at least in theory, could be matched to a document in a way that was far harder to fake than a written description. It was the beginning of a profound shift, from identity as something you declared to identity as something that could be visually verified. That shift has never stopped accelerating. The League of Nations continued to refine its passport standards throughout the 1920s and 1930s, with follow-up conferences in 1926 and 1937. The basic framework established in 1920. It standardized size and required a photograph, issued by a recognized national government. But just as the system was beginning to stabilize, just as the world seemed to be moving toward a rational coordinated framework for managing human movement across borders, the world descended into a second catastrophe. And this time, the passport itself would become a weapon. There is a version of the history of passports that presents them as neutral bureaucratic tools, practical systems for managing the flow of people across borders. That version is incomplete, and to complete it, we have to confront one of the darkest chapters in the history of documentation. In Nazi Germany, identity documents became instruments of persecution and ultimately of genocide. When the Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933, one of its primary tools for implementing its racial ideology was the documentation system. The state began categorizing its population. First Jews, then Roma, then people with disabilities, then political opponents, and attaching those categories to identity documents. In 1938, following a direct agreement with Switzerland, which wanted to prevent Jewish refugees from entering, the Nazi government began stamping the passports of Jewish Germans with a large red letter J. The purpose was explicit: to allow border agents in other countries to immediately identify and turn away Jewish travelers before they could seek refuge. Think about what that means for a moment. A document that was supposed to facilitate movement, allowing a person to travel, was being weaponized to restrict it. The passport had become a tool of exclusion at the very moment that millions of people most desperately needed a way out. Many of those people did not get out, and the role of documentation in that failure is one of the most sobering chapters in the history of government control over human movement. The problem was compounded by statelessness. As the Nazi regime stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship through the Nuremberg laws of 1935, reducing Jews to subjects rather than citizens of the state, hundreds of thousands of people found themselves holding passports from a country that no longer recognized them as its own. And a passport from a government that has repudiated you is worthless at a border. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge one of the most remarkable humanitarian innovations in this entire story: the Nansen passport. Fridtjof Nansen was a Norwegian explorer and humanitarian who served as the League of Nations' first High Commissioner for Refugees. In the early 1920s, following the Russian Revolution and the collapse of several empires, hundreds of thousands of people found themselves stateless. Russian exiles, Armenians who had survived genocide, Turks displaced by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In 1922, Nansen proposed an internationally recognized travel document for stateless people. Over 50 countries agreed to recognize it, and the Nansen passport allowed hundreds of thousands of stateless individuals to cross borders, seek work, and rebuild their lives. Among the recipients of Nansen passports were some of the 20th century's most celebrated figures: artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals displaced by war and revolution. The philosopher Hannah Arendt held one. The composer Igor Stravinsky also held one. And so did the painter Marc Chagall. It was proof that the international community could choose to recognize the humanity of stateless people, when it chose to. After the Second World War, the international community made a formal commitment. It was to address the catastrophic failures of documentation and refugee protection that had contributed to the scale of the Holocaust and wartime displacement. The 1951 Refugee Convention, one of the foundational documents of modern international law, established the rights of refugees and the obligations of states to protect them. Critically, it enshrined the principle of non-refoulement. No state could return a refugee to a place where their life or freedom would be threatened. The Second World War had done something else, too. It had permanently hardened the connection between nationality, citizenship, and the passport. In the post-war world, the passport was no longer primarily a travel document. It was a declaration of national identity, a statement about which state was responsible for you as a human being. Borders started to harden, and the document that got you across them became more consequential than it had ever been. If the Second World War hardened borders, the Cold War turned them into ideological battlegrounds. For roughly 4 decades after 1945, the world was divided into 2 competing blocs: the Western democracies led by the United States and the communist states led by the Soviet Union. And one of the starkest differences between these 2 worlds was the reflection of their relationship to human freedom and their right to move. In the Soviet Union, movement was not a right. It was a privilege, and one that was tightly controlled by the state. Soviet citizens were subject to a system of internal passports, the Propiska system, that controlled not just international travel but movement within the country itself. Introduced by Stalin in 1932, the system required citizens to register their place of residence with the state and to carry documents specifying where they were allowed to live and work. Moving from one city to another required official permission. For many Soviet citizens, particularly those in rural areas or those deemed politically unreliable, that permission was simply not given. Exit visas, permissions to leave the country, were another tool of control. Soviet citizens who wished to travel abroad had to submit to background checks and wait, sometimes for years, and face the real possibility that permission would never come. Those who did manage to travel abroad often did so under close surveillance, knowing that family members left behind served, in effect, as insurance against defection. The Berlin Wall, perhaps the most potent symbol of Cold War division, was ultimately a monument to passport control at its most extreme. Its purpose was not to keep people out, but to keep people in. Built in 1961 to stop the flood of East Germans seeking a better life in the West. The wall killed more than 100 people who tried to cross it over its 28 years of existence. When it fell in November 1989, the crowds that poured through the checkpoints were not just celebrating the end of a barrier. They were celebrating the return of something they had been denied for decades: the freedom to simply leave. For those who lived under these systems, the right to travel and the right to simply go somewhere else was not abstract or theoretical. It was the difference between freedom and a kind of imprisonment that wore the face of normality. The Cold War made one thing absolutely clear: the ability to travel is not just a convenience, it is a form of freedom. And governments have always known that controlling travel means controlling people, Every authoritarian state in history has understood this. The passport is not neutral, and it never was. Not every story in the history of the passport is one of restriction and control. Some chapters offer a different vision, a vision of what happens when states choose to lower their borders rather than raise them. In the decades after the Second World War, Western European nations were determined to build a new kind of order, one that would make another European war not just unlikely, but structurally impossible. The path they chose was integration, economic, political, and ultimately personal. What began as an economic arrangement, the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, then the European Economic Community in 1957, gradually evolved into something far more ambitious, the European Union. And one of the most tangible expressions of that ambition was the Schengen Agreement. Signed in 1985 aboard a riverboat on the Moselle River, near the tiny Luxembourg village of Schengen, the agreement was initially modest in scope. 5 countries, France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, agreeing to gradually eliminate passport controls between themselves. By 1995, it came into full effect, and today, the Schengen area encompasses 27 countries, covering most of continental Europe, a zone where over 400 million people can move freely without stopping at border checkpoints. For citizens of Schengen countries, the border had become, in a very real sense, invisible. You drive from France into Germany, and there is no checkpoint. No stamp in your passport, just a sign by the road telling you that you have crossed a border that was once one of the most heavily militarized in European history. The European Union also standardized its members' passports. All EU member states now issue passports in the same burgundy red color, with the same format and the words European Union on the cover above the country name. It is a small but powerful symbol. These passports say, you belong not just to your country, but to something larger. The Schengen experiment was not without its tensions. Debates about immigration, security, and national sovereignty have periodically put pressure on the system. And in moments of crisis, terrorist attacks, mass refugee movements, and the COVID-19 pandemic, some member states temporarily reinstated border controls. But the fundamental principle, that free movement is a right worth protecting, that the ability to cross a border without papers between neighboring countries is a mark of civilization rather than a security risk, has survived. And in a world where borders have so often been instruments of division and suffering, that is worth pausing to appreciate. September 11th, 2001. 19 men boarded 4 commercial airplanes in the United States. All 19 of them passed through security checkpoints using legitimate identity documents. In the years that followed, the question of how identity documents could be made more secure, more verifiably tied to the specific person they claimed to represent, became one of the central preoccupations of governments and security agencies around the world. The 9/11 attacks did not create the push toward biometric passports from scratch. That movement had been building for years, driven by advances in technology and long-standing concerns about document fraud. But they dramatically accelerated it. Border security was suddenly not a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a matter of national survival. In 2002, the International Civil Aviation Organization, also known as ICAO, set standards for international aviation. It endorsed a global standard for biometric passports. The standard called for an embedded contactless microchip containing the passport holder's personal data and biometric information. But what does biometric mean exactly? Well, in the context of passports, it refers to measurable biological characteristics that can be used to uniquely identify an individual. The first and most universal of these is the facial image, a digitized version of the passport photograph stored on the chip, allowing border systems to compare the face of the person standing at the checkpoint with the face stored in the document. But biometrics do not stop there. Many countries have added fingerprint data to their passport chips. Some are experimenting with iris scans. The United States, the European Union, and dozens of other countries have now deployed biometric passports as their standard travel document. At modern airports, the biometric passport has enabled a new kind of border crossing, the automated e-gate. You approach the gate, you place your passport on the scanner, the machine reads your chip, verifies your photograph against your face using facial recognition software, and if everything matches, the gate opens in seconds without a human agent ever looking at you. It is seamless, it is fast, and it represents a profound shift in the nature of the relationship between the state and the individual at the border. Because the biometric passport is not just a travel document, it is a node in a global data network. The information on your chip can be accessed, with the right equipment and the right agreements, by any border agency that participates in the international system. Your biometric data, your travel history, your identity, all of it potentially readable by governments around the world, in ways that would have been unimaginable to the delegates who sat in Paris in 1920. The passport has traveled an extraordinary distance, from wax seals on parchment to encrypted microchips, in the space of a few centuries. And with each technological leap, the balance between security, efficiency, and privacy has had to be renegotiated. That negotiation is still very much ongoing. We have spent much of this video looking at how passports developed, the history, the politics, the technology. But there is one dimension of the passport story that is perhaps the most consequential for the billions of people living it today, and that being, not all passports are equal. Every year, organizations that track global mobility publish what is commonly called the Passport Index, a ranking of the world's passports by the number of countries their holders can visit without obtaining a prior visa. At the top of the rankings, you will typically find passports from Japan, Singapore, Germany, Sweden, and other wealthy, diplomatically well-connected nations, documents that grant their holders visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to more than 190 countries. Essentially, the entire world opens to them. At the bottom, you will find passports from countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Documents that grant visa-free access to fewer than 30 countries, less than a fifth of the world. But what is it that determines a passport's power? There are three primary factors, and they are worth understanding analytically rather than emotionally. First, economic power. Wealthy countries have leverage in diplomatic negotiations. They can offer trading relationships, investment, tourism revenue, and visa reciprocity in return. They can also build and maintain the consular infrastructure around the world that makes visa-free arrangements work in practice. Second, diplomatic relationships. Visa-free access is granted bilaterally, through specific agreements between specific countries. These agreements are built on trust, shared history, and political alignment. Countries that are deeply integrated into the international order, that participate in international institutions, and maintain stable diplomatic relationships, tend to have more of these agreements than the countries that are isolated, sanctioned, or in conflict. And then there's political stability. Countries with stable, functioning governments and consistent rule of law are trusted by other states to manage their own borders responsibly and to verify the identities of their own citizens. A country that is in the middle of a civil war, or that lacks a functioning civil registry system, or that has a history of document fraud, will find other countries reluctant to extend visa-free access to its passport holders, regardless of who those individuals are. It is worth being direct about what passport inequality means in practice, not in abstract policy terms, but in the lived experience of real people. If you hold a strong passport, the world is essentially open to you. You book a flight, you arrive, you are welcomed. If you hold a weak passport, international travel is bureaucratic, expensive, uncertain, and often humiliating. You apply for a visa weeks in advance. You may be required to demonstrate financial resources, a confirmed return ticket, proof of accommodation, and letters of invitation. You submit to scrutiny designed to assess whether you are likely to overstay or not return. And you may be denied, with no explanation and no appeal. The burden falls most heavily on the people who can least afford it. The passport inequality we observe today is not random. It is a reflection of centuries of unequal development, colonial extraction, and geopolitical power asymmetries. The countries with the most powerful passports today are, in almost every case, the countries that dominated the international order for the past 2 centuries. And the countries with the weakest passports are, in almost every case, the countries that were colonized, exploited, or sidelined by that same order. This is not a political argument for any particular policy. It is simply a description of a pattern, one that becomes visible when you step back and look at the passport not as a bureaucratic object, but as what it actually is, a product of history. We started this journey thousands of years ago, in ancient Mesopotamia, with clay tablets and letters of authorization. We traveled through the empires of Persia and Rome, through the fractured feudal landscape of medieval Europe, through the wars and revolutions that gave birth to the modern nation-state. We watched as delegates gathered in Paris in 1920 and decided, for the first time, what a standardized global travel document should look like. We confronted how that same document was weaponized in the Nazi era to trap the very people who most needed to escape. We saw how the Cold War turned the right to travel into a political privilege, and how the European Union dared to imagine a different future, where borders between neighbors could simply dissolve. We followed the passport into the digital age, where it became not just a booklet but a biometric profile, a node in a vast global security network. And we looked, honestly, at the world as it is today, where the document you happen to be born holding shapes the freedom you will have for the rest of your life. There is something deeply strange about the passport when you stop and really think about it. It is a piece of paper, or a laminated card, or a microchip-embedded booklet. It weighs almost nothing. It fits in your pocket. You can leave it on the kitchen counter and forget about it for years. And yet it contains, in its few pages, centuries of accumulated history. The history of how states learned to identify their populations. The history of how borders were drawn, enforced, and in some places dissolved. The history of who belongs and who doesn't. Every time a border agent takes your passport and opens it, they are participating in a system that was built piece by piece over centuries. A system designed, ultimately, to answer one of the oldest questions in human civilization. Who are you, and do you have permission to be here? For most of human history, that question was answered by who you served. then by what nation you were born into, then by what your face looked like in a photograph. Today, by what your fingerprints and facial geometry say about you. The answers keep changing, the question stays the same. The passport is not going away, but it is not static either. It has always changed, in response to wars, to technology, to political movements, to the shifting question of who counts as a person deserving of recognition by the international community. And perhaps the most important thing to understand about it is this. The passport is a human invention. It was designed by people, for purposes that those people chose, which means it can be redesigned and reformed. The inequalities it reflects are not natural laws. They are political choices, made by human beings, at specific moments in history, for specific reasons. The passport has shaped the course of human history in ways that most of us never stop to consider. It has protected people, it has trapped them, it has been a tool of freedom and a tool of oppression, sometimes at the same time. It has been standardized, weaponized, digitized, and debated. And through all of it, it remains what it has always been, an answer offered by a government to a traveler to the oldest question at every border in the world. Who are you? And do you have permission to be here?